The scent of bleach and despair was the first thing I remembered from the end of my last life. A sterile, chemical sharpness that clung to the thin sheets and the faded blue of the hospital gown. It was the smell of giving up. That and the flickering television bolted to the wall in the corner of the cheap, state-funded room. On the screen, a local news channel was celebrating the city's newest culinary power couple, my sister Amelia and my fiancé, Marcus. They were at the lavish grand opening of his restaurant chain, Thorne's Smokehouse, built on the secret recipe I had naively given him, the one that was supposed to have been the foundation of our future. He raised a glass of champagne, his arms snaked possessively around Amelia's glittering waist. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a diamond necklace I'd never seen before sparkling at her throat. My family wasn't by my bedside. They were at the party, of course, standing just behind the happy couple, beaming for the cameras. They'd stopped paying my medical bills weeks ago. "It's just not a sound investment anymore, Alara," my father had explained during his last brief visit, his gaze fixed somewhere over my head. "We have to think of the restaurant's future." The secret to my grandfather's famous ember-kissed ribs was the only part of me they had ever truly valued, and once I had given it away, the vessel that housed it was deemed worthless. I died alone, listening to the distant sound of their celebration. My last breath, a rattling, defeated sigh of regret, and then I gasped. The air wasn't sterile. It was thick and alive, a rich, smoky perfume of hickory wood, caramelized brown sugar, and a dozen secret spices that I knew better than my own name. It was the soul of my kitchen. My eyes shot open. I wasn't in a flimsy hospital bed, staring at a cracked ceiling. I was on my feet, standing in the familiar, oppressive heat of the kitchen at Laurel's Landing, my family's restaurant. My body, which I last remembered as a skeletal, wasted thing, felt solid, strong. I looked down at my hands. They weren't the pale, bruised claws of a dying woman. They were a chef's hands, calloused and capable, a light sheen of cooking oil glistening under the fluorescent lights. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I gripped the edge of the stainless steel prep table, the cool metal a grounding shock. On a nearby wall, a delivery calendar was pinned. The date at the top read June 14th, 2023. I had gone back 5 years. I was 22 again, trapped in the day my ruin began. A burst of tinkling laughter drifted through the service window. It was my mother's, a carefully manicured sound she reserved for impressing important guests. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I crept forward, my kitchen clogs silent on the worn linoleum, and peered into the dining room. There they were, seated at the best table by the window, a perfect tableau of happy, successful family life. My father, Richard, with his self-satisfied smile and expensive suit, was pouring wine. My mother, Catherine, was the picture of elegance, her posture impeccable. And my younger sister, Amelia, beautiful and radiant, was positively sparkling. Sitting across from them, basking in their sycophantic attention, was the serpent himself, Marcus Thorne. This was it, the very first time he had ever set foot in our restaurant. The day the first domino fell. He looked exactly as I remembered, handsome and predatory, his charm a carefully polished weapon. In my first life, I saw him as a savior. Now, I saw him for what he was, an executioner. But as I stood there, shrouded in the kitchen's shadows, a cold, hard certainty settled deep in my bones. I wasn't the condemned anymore. The timeline had snapped back, the pieces of my life reset on the board. And this time, I knew how the game was played. My grandfather, Thomas Laurel, was the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. He was a culinary artist, a man who believed that food was memory and a recipe was a story passed down through generations. While my father was busy with business school, learning about profit margins and branding, I was in the kitchen with Grandpa, learning about the soul of cooking. He taught me how to listen to the sizzle of onions in a pan, how to feel when bread was perfectly proofed, how to coax flavor from the humblest ingredients. Laurel's Landing was his dream, a simple, honest place built on his talent. But his masterpiece, the dish that drew people from 3 states away, was his ember-kissed ribs. The recipe was a complex, 3-day symphony of technique and intuition. It involved a secret dry rub with 16 ingredients, a specific blend of hickory and applewood for the smoker, and a finishing glaze that had to be lacquered onto the meat in 6 separate paper-thin layers. It was alchemy. On his deathbed, he bypassed his own son and gave the recipe to me, written on a set of yellowed index cards. "This is your heart on a plate, Ilara," he'd whispered, his hand trembling as he pressed the cards into mine. "It's your inheritance. Don't ever let anyone take it from you, especially not those who see it only as a path to money." I promised I would protect it. It was a sacred vow. After he was gone, my family wasted no time in twisting his legacy to serve their own greed. The restaurant was remodeled, prices were tripled, and I became the engine hidden in the basement. My entire existence was reduced to a single function: to produce endless racks of perfect ribs. I was a ghost in their machine, working 16-hour days in the sweltering kitchen while they basked in the glory my labor provided. My father rebranded himself as the visionary owner, taking credit in magazines and on local news. My mother played the gracious hostess, accepting accolades for the ambiance she created. And Amelia, my beautiful, useless sister, became the face of Laurel's Landing. Her cruelty was a special kind of art form. She'd drift into the kitchen an hour before service, dressed for a night out, and complain about the heat. "Still playing with fire, Ella?" she'd sneer, plucking a perfectly glazed rib off the resting rack before I could stop her. "Honestly, I don't know how you stand it. You always smell like a bonfire." One afternoon, a prominent food critic from a national magazine came to dine. I spent hours crafting the most perfect plate of my life. Every detail was flawless. My parents insisted on bringing the critic back for a kitchen tour. I stood there, sweating in my apron, expecting a word of thanks. Instead, my father gestured vaguely in my direction. "And this is our tireless worker, Ilara." Then he'd placed a proud arm around Amelia, who had just arrived. "But this one," he'd boomed, "this is our muse. Amelia has the palate. She's the one who inspires the flavors." The critic beamed at Amelia, who preened and offered a few vapid comments about flavor profiles. I was invisible, a tool. They systematically dismantled any chance I had at a life outside their control. When I was accepted into the Culinary Institute of America, my father declared it a frivolous expense. "Everything you need to know you can learn right here," he'd said, conveniently omitting that my free labor was the bedrock of his financial success. They intercepted invitations from friends, inventing catering emergencies that required my immediate attention. All the money I technically earned was funneled into a joint family account to which I had no access. They kept me isolated, exhausted, and dependent. Then Marcus arrived, a wolf wearing the clothing of a savior. He was a successful restaurateur with sharp eyes and an even sharper ambition. My parents saw him not as a man, but as an exit strategy, a merger that would launch their brand into the stratosphere. They pushed me at him relentlessly. "Our Ilara is the real genius here," my father would tell him, a salesman hawking his prize commodity. For the first time in years, someone looked at me with what I mistook for genuine interest. Marcus praised my skill. He asked about my dreams. He listened. He painted a beautiful picture of a future where we would build a culinary empire together, side by side. He promised me a life beyond the smoke and the grease. Starved for affection and desperate for escape, I didn't just fall for him. I plummeted. The night I gave him the recipe was the culmination of his campaign. We were at his penthouse apartment overlooking the city lights. He spoke of trust, of partnership, of tearing down all the walls between us. With tears of gratitude in my eyes, I painstakingly copied my grandfather's sacred words onto a piece of his expensive stationery. He kissed me, his touch triumphant, and told me he loved me. The next morning, he was gone. My calls went to voicemail. A week later, his lawyer sent a curt email, ending our personal and professional relationship. When I confronted my family, hysterical with grief, the mask of their support dropped. "You let him trick you?" my father had roared, his face purple with rage. "After everything we've done for you, you were that stupid. You've ruined this family." Amelia had watched, a smug, satisfied smile on her face. "You always were too needy, Ella," she'd chimed in. "A man like Marcus wants a partner, not a charity case." The combined weight of the heartbreak and their brutal accusations crushed me. My body gave out. A raging fever turned into a severe autoimmune disorder, exacerbated by stress and exhaustion. As my health declined, so did their patience. The medical bills piled up. With me too sick to cook, the restaurant's quality plummeted, and so did their income. They saw my treatment not as a necessity, but as a drain on their dwindling resources. They moved me to a state-funded facility, stopped visiting, and left me to die alone. My final moments spent watching them toast my replacement on television. But now, standing in the kitchen, the scent of hickory filling my lungs with life, not death, the past was not a source of pain. It was a blueprint, a detailed schematic of their greed, their weaknesses, their desires. I had been given the impossible, a second chance. Not to reclaim my old life, but to orchestrate the justice I had been denied. They were all out there, smiling and laughing, setting the same trap as before. They didn't know the mouse had come back as a cat. My turning point wasn't a dramatic outburst, it was a silent, cold vow I made to myself over the hiss of the flat-top grill. I would play my part. I would be the shy, talented girl. I would fall in love with the handsome prince. I would give them everything they wanted. And then I would burn their kingdom to the ground. The first step was to perform. I took a deep, steadying breath, wiped my hands on my apron, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room, my face arranged into a mask of shy deference. "I'm so sorry for the wait on the appetizers," I murmured, directing my words to the table, but keeping my eyes mostly on the floor. "We had a big rush." It was a flawless reenactment of my behavior from the first time around. Marcus immediately rose to his feet, a gentleman's gesture that was pure theater. "Please don't apologize," he said, his voice as smooth as a fine reduction sauce. "A meal like this is worth any wait. Your father tells me you're the artist responsible." "She's a natural," my father boomed, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Got her grandfather's touch." I allowed a blush to creep up my neck. "Grandpa taught me everything," I said quietly. The performance was sickeningly easy. I had played the part of the timid doormat for years. It was a second skin. The following weeks unfolded like a scene-for-scene remake of a tragedy I had already watched. Marcus sent extravagant bouquets of flowers to the restaurant. My parents, ecstatic, arranged dinners and relentlessly sang my praises to him. Amelia watched from the sidelines, her expression a toxic cocktail of jealousy and smug superiority. She was convinced he was just using me to get to the family's assets, and that once the deal was done, he would discard me for a more polished and beautiful prize. Her. Her arrogance was a critical vulnerability I planned to exploit. I allowed Marcus to court me, every action a carefully calibrated move in a deadly game. I let him take me to expensive restaurants, listening to his hollow compliments about my untapped potential. I endured his touch, his feigned interest, his empty promises of a future where we would be partners. Every word he spoke was a ghost from my past, but this time they held no power. They were merely data points, confirming the path he was on. While the grand drama of my courtship played out in the front of house, my real work began late at night, in the silence of the empty restaurant. I wasn't just a chef, I was now a saboteur, a spy in my own life. I used a cash gift from Marcus, for a new dress, he'd said with a wink, to purchase a high-end audio recorder, small enough to hide in my apron pocket, and a USB keylogger. One night, feigning a migraine, I stayed behind after everyone had left. With trembling hands, I plugged the keylogger into the back of the office computer, the digital heart of my father's empire. It was a simple, invisible piece of hardware that would capture every keystroke, every password, every panicked email. The recordings I gathered were more damning than I could have hoped. I captured my mother on the phone with her sister, bragging, "This Marcus Thorne is the answer to all our problems. He's old money and he's absolutely smitten with Alara's cooking. Once he's family, we'll have access to his capital for the franchise expansion." I recorded my father in the office, muttering to himself as he cooked the books, siphoning money from the restaurant's accounts payable into a personal investment portfolio. "A little off the top for a rainy day," he'd chuckle. "What they don't know won't hurt them." Amelia was a fountain of venom. I caught her talking to a friend, her voice dripping with disdain. Honestly, it's embarrassing watching her. She's like a rescue puppy, so grateful for a scrap of attention. Marcus will get the recipe and then he'll get bored. Just you watch. He looks at me when she's not paying attention. Each recording, each stolen password, each line of financial data was a nail I was methodically hammering into their collective coffin. They thought they were in control, authoring my destiny. They had no idea I was the one writing the final chapter. The next phase of my plan required a different kind of stage. I created a food blog, Grandpa's Ghost. The aesthetic was rustic and heartfelt, filled with sepia-toned photos of my grandfather's old handwritten recipe cards for dishes I didn't care about. I wrote in a warm, nostalgic voice, positioning myself as a custodian of lost family traditions. For weeks, I posted simple, foolproof recipes: a perfect buttermilk biscuit, a classic chicken pot pie, a comforting tomato soup. I engaged with every commenter, answered every question, and built a small but fiercely loyal community. They saw Grandpa's Ghost as an authentic, generous spirit in a world of slick, commercialized food media. I was setting the stage, creating a platform of unimpeachable trust. The climax of Marcus's seduction campaign arrived right on schedule. He took me to Aria, the city's most exclusive and expensive restaurant. Over a dessert that cost more than my weekly grocery budget in my first life, he laid his trap. He took both my hands in his expression a masterpiece of feigned sincerity. "Ilara," he began, his voice a low thrum. "What we have is more than just a feeling. It's a business proposition, a dynasty. I want to build an empire with you. I want to put your name up in lights. But to do that, I need to be all in. I need your complete trust. I need the recipe." There it was, the moment that had shattered me. This time, I was ready. I let a single perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. I looked into his eyes, a trembling, love-struck fool. "I trust you, Marcus," I whispered. "I've never trusted anyone more." He slid a heavy piece of cream-colored parchment and a gleaming fountain pen across the table. "For us," he said. "For our future." My hand was steady as I began to write. The recipe I transcribed looked, to the untrained eye, identical to my grandfather's. The ingredients were the same, the steps were in the correct order, the temperatures were listed, but I made two minuscule, critical alterations, changes born from weeks of late-night research into food chemistry. First, I changed the grade of molasses in the glaze from robust to blackstrap, an almost imperceptible swap. Second, and most crucially, I substituted a specific, imported balsamic vinegar for the domestic apple cider vinegar my grandfather used in the brining liquid. To a home cook making a single rack, the difference would be unnoticeable. But I knew that when the recipe was scaled up for mass commercial production, a catastrophic chemical reaction would occur. The sulfur compounds in the blackstrap molasses, combined with the high acetic acid content of that specific balsamic and heated at the precise smoking temperature I listed, would effectively denature the proteins in the pork. The meat wouldn't become tender. It would become tough, rubbery, and imbued with a deeply unpleasant, sour, metallic flavor. It was a culinary time bomb, and I had just handed him the detonator. He folded the parchment with a reverence that made me want to laugh, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of conquest. He thought he had just acquired the crown jewels. I returned to the restaurant that night, my heart a cold, steady drum. I sat down at the office computer, logged onto my blog, and began to type. I wrote a long, emotional introduction about my grandfather, about his belief that food was love and that love should be shared. Then, with a final decisive click, I published the post. "Some things are too good to keep secret. My grandfather's ember-kissed ribs, a gift to you all." It contained the real recipe, every detail, every secret, every nuance. I attached high-resolution scans of his original handwritten cards for authenticity. Then, I spent the next 2 hours blasting the link to every food blogger, celebrity chef, and news outlet I could find. My work done, I went up to my small apartment above the restaurant and slept without dreaming for the first time in either of my lives. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. Within 48 hours, Grandpa's Ghost was the biggest story in the food world. The hashtag #HashGrandpa'sGhostRibs was trending globally. Home cooks, professional chefs, and everyone in between were trying the recipe and posting photos of their flawless, succulent results. It was a viral phenomenon. The shockwave hit Laurel's Landing like a physical blow. The phone began to ring, a shrill, incessant harbinger of doom. But the calls weren't for reservations, they were cancellations. Dozens of them. Why would we pay $80 for a rack of ribs I can now make in my own backyard? One former regular bluntly asked my mother. Our bookings for the next 3 months, our lifeblood vanished in 72 hours. My father stormed through the restaurant like a caged animal, his face mottled with rage and disbelief. Who is this person? He bellowed, slamming a printed copy of the blog post on the counter. How could they have gotten the recipe? It's corporate espionage. We'll sue them into oblivion. I watched him, my face a carefully constructed mask of shared panic. I don't know how, Dad, I said, my voice trembling. It's identical, but how can we sue an anonymous blog? We never patented it. Grandpa said it would be like patenting a memory. The atmosphere in the restaurant turned toxic. The once bustling dining room was a morgue. The silence was punctuated only by the increasingly frequent and hostile calls from our suppliers, demanding payment on long overdue invoices. My family, stripped of their success, turned on each other with a feral viciousness. My father blamed my mother for not being charming enough to retain their clientele. My mother blamed Amelia for being a useless financial drain, and Amelia, cornered and terrified, blamed me. This is somehow your fault, she shrieked at me during a particularly nasty argument. If you had just sealed the deal with Marcus faster, we'd have his money right now, and none of this would matter. I just absorbed her tirade, my secret audio recorder capturing every pathetic, desperate word. Meanwhile, Marcus, oblivious to the storm that had already broken over our heads, was preparing for his triumph. He had sunk millions of his investors' dollars into a nationwide launch for his new flagship chain, Thorne's Smokehouse. The grand opening of the New York City location was a black-tie media extravaganza, the culinary event of the year. I was to be there. On his arm, the soon-to-be fiancé and muse. My family, seeing his launch as their only remaining lifeboat, practically shoved me into the limousine he sent, their faces etched with a desperate, hungry hope. The restaurant was an exercise in opulent arrogance. Ice sculptures, champagne fountains, and a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns filled a cavernous space. I stood beside Marcus on a makeshift red carpet, smiling demurely for the cameras, a lamb leading a wolf to his own public execution. He leaned into a microphone on stage, his voice booming with confidence. Tonight, we are not just serving a meal, he declared to the rapt audience of food critics and investors. Tonight, we redefine American barbecue. Prepare to taste the future. The moment arrived. A legion of waiters marched out from the kitchen, bearing silver platters piled high with glistening, fragrant ribs. A hush fell over the room. Forks and knives were lifted, and then the first bites were taken. It began as a subtle shift in the room's energy, a confused murmur. A prominent critic for the Times, a man whose word could make or break a restaurant, paused mid-chew, his brow furrowed. He discreetly removed the mouthful of food into his napkin. Across the room, an influencer lowered her phone, her foodie rapture smile replaced by a grimace. The whispers grew louder. Is it supposed to be this chewy? Mine has a strange chemical taste. It's sour. Marcus, still beaming on stage, hadn't noticed. But I had. I watched as his empire crumbled in a single silent moment of collective disgust. He finally seemed to sense the shift and grabbed a rib from a passing platter, taking a huge, confident bite. His face was a cinematic masterpiece of dawning horror. He chewed once, twice, his jaw working against the rubbery meat. The color drained from his face. He stared at the rib in his hand as if it were a venomous snake, and then his eyes, wide with panic and fury, found mine across the room. He knew. The event was a catastrophe of legendary proportions. The next day's headlines were a bloodbath. Thorne's House of Horrors, $1 million mistake, the toughest ribs in town. His investors were apoplectic. Lawsuits were filed before lunch. He called my cell, his voice a raw scream of rage. You! What did you do? You gave me a fake recipe. You sabotaged me. A fake? I replied, pitching my voice to a wounded, terrified whimper. No, Marcus, I swear. That's the recipe I've always used in the kitchen. I wrote it down perfectly. He wasn't buying it. He stormed into Laurel's Landing later that afternoon, his face a mask of thunder, just as the restaurant was receiving a foreclosure notice from the bank. You and your family of backwater frauds, he roared, slamming his fist on the hostess stand where my mother stood, pale with shock. You set me up. You're going to pay for this. Our daughter would never, my father blustered, stepping between them. She's a simple girl. She's not clever enough to pull something like this off. It was the perfect cue. As they screamed, the front door opened, and a well-known investigative journalist, a woman I had been anonymously feeding information to for 2 weeks, walked in with a cameraman. Excuse me, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. I'm doing a story on the grandpa's ghost recipe. I was told the author might be here. Every head swiveled towards me. I stood apart from my family, my back straight. I took a deep breath and let the mask of the timid girl fall away forever. I am Grandpa's ghost, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity and strength no one in that room had ever heard from me before. And for my entire life, this family has treated me like one. And then I gave them my story, the real one. I spoke of my grandfather's love and his legacy. I spoke of the years of indentured servitude, the stolen credit, the emotional abuse, the isolation. And as my family and Marcus began to sputter denials, I pulled out my phone and connected it to the restaurant's sound system. The room filled with their own voices, their own damning words. My mother, bragging about selling me off. My father, admitting to cooking the books. Amelia, dripping with venomous jealousy. I laid it all bare. The final piece of evidence was a copy of the bank records I'd given the journalist, showing years of embezzlement. The camera zoomed in on the foreclosure notice still clutched in my father's trembling hand. A perfect final image of poetic justice. The aftermath was swift and total. My family was socially and financially annihilated. The news story went national, a salacious tale of greed, betrayal, and culinary justice. They became local pariahs. Laurel's Landing was shuttered, its assets liquidated to pay off a fraction of their debts. I saw my father once, months later, stocking shelves at a grocery store, his shoulders slumped, his face gray and vacant. I saw a picture of Amelia online, her hair a mess, wearing a stained apron at a greasy spoon diner, the kind of place she used to mock. My mother, I heard, had moved in with her sister, a guest in a house where she was no longer the queen. They were ruined, stripped of everything they held dear, left with nothing but the bitter taste of their own choices. Marcus Thorne was buried in an avalanche of lawsuits from his investors and suppliers, his reputation as a restaurateur utterly destroyed. He was a cautionary tale whispered about in the industry. My story, however, was just beginning. The Grandpa's Ghost blog became a sensation. I was flooded with offers for book deals, TV shows, and partnerships. I accepted a lucrative offer for a cookbook, a beautiful tribute to my grandfather filled with his stories and recipes. I used the advance to buy a small, charming brick building in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. I opened my own restaurant, Ember. It was the antithesis of Laurel's Landing, small, warm, and honest. The kitchen was open, the staff were paid well and treated with respect, and the food was made with love. It was a success from the day it opened, celebrated for its heart as much as its flavors. One evening, a few years later, I was a guest on a national morning show. The host, after tasting a rib I'd prepared, leaned in conspiratorially. "Alara," she said, "after everything you went through with your family, how do you not feel bitter?" I looked directly into the camera, a small, genuine smile on my face. "My grandfather taught me that the best ingredients are honesty and generosity," I said. My family forgot that. They thought his recipe was a secret to be hoarded. But its real magic, its real power, was always in the sharing. I was free, I was happy, and I was the sole author of my own story. Justice, I'd learned, was a dish best served not cold, but slow-smoked over hickory and glazed to absolute perfection.